Welcome once again to our video Bible study on how we got the Bible. This is now session 9 out of 10 sessions, which we will be completing here this fall. Let's begin again with prayer. Gracious God, again we hold before you all of those who we have cares and concerns about in our homes and our families and beyond. We ask your blessing upon all who are participating in this Bible study, that it will deepen our understanding of the precious gift you have given us in your word. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So we are in that section of our notes, and in the section of the Old Testament called the Ketuvim, or the writings, and just a little bit of an overview of where we were last time. And you may want to refer to that writings timeline. We are now in what is called the Second Temple period, which runs from the time after the end of the Babylonian captivity, when the Judeans returned from exile, and they rebuild the temple and then the walls of Jerusalem. And the second temple, Solomon's temple, was destroyed. The second temple era then actually continues all the way to 70 AD, when once again the temple will be destroyed, this time by the Romans. We looked a little bit at that history, which is somewhat unfamiliar. Immediately post-exile, Judea was part of the Persian Empire, and was a comfortable time of rebuilding. That's the Persian period. And then Alexander the Greek overwhelmed the Persian Empire, and they became part of the Greek Empire, unified under Alexander in the 4th century. But after his death, dividing up into 4 parts, and 2 of the parts impacted the Judeans. To the north of them was the Syrian Greek Empire, and to the south was the Egyptian Greek Empire, and sometimes Jerusalem and Judea would be caught in between. And eventually, because of atrocities done by the Syrian Greek emperor, the Maccabees rose up and wrested independence for about 100 years, independence from any of those empires, until 63 BC, the Romans gobbled up everything. When we looked at this, at the writings, well, last time we looked at the historical writings. Ezra and Nehemiah, which we have in the Old Testament, give us something of that story of the return and the rebuilding, but nothing really beyond that. We go into a somewhat dark period of history with only exterior information about what's going on. Also on the historical writings, there the period was Chronicles, which we have as 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It is a retelling from a priestly point of view, Israel's history going back to the reign of David. It's probably written, though, in the Persian period, and interestingly, it really focuses upon the reign of David, and it actually ignores the northern kingdom once it falls, and focuses on the history of the south all the way through the return from exile the last verses of 2nd Chronicles are the same as the first verses of the book of Ezra, which indicates that maybe Ezra had something to do with that, bringing the Chronicles into writing. A couple of other books we have in here are 1st and 2nd Esdras, which you've never heard of maybe. Interspersed in all of this, we have these books that in our Bible would be considered Apocrypha, and actually a Lutheran Bible would have a section of Apocrypha right at the end of the Old Testament. We don't buy Lutheran Bibles here in the United States. They are Puritan Bibles, and the Apocrypha is dropped out. How all of that happens is going to be part of a story later on. And so some of these books now, in their writings, I will be referring to as in our Apocrypha, even though that terminology would be totally unheard of, foreign totally to this period in time. 1st and 2nd Esdras don't give us much information at all historically. They're late. They're only in Greek. Maybe were written about 150 BC, or even later than that. 1st and 2nd Maccabees are interesting historically, and they tell the story of that wresting Judea away from the empires around them and becoming independent for 100 years. And so that's an interesting piece of history, but matter of fact, then that's the only history from that period that appears. The next section of writings would be poetry, and on that timeline, those are kind of in the pink there. Last time we talked about the poetry of Israel, and noticed how it was always in couplets, a statement, a following statement in some relationship to each other. Well, I'm going to move right away, though, now to Psalms. And in your notes, this would be actually page 3 under the writings section. I'm not going to spend time on individual Psalms. The book of Psalms, along with Isaiah, is the most quoted part of the Old Testament in the New Testament. And probably the Psalms are the most widely known parts of the Old Testament for us. They appeared over a long period of time. Some may have been from before the time of David and carried by oral tradition because they were sung, you see. They were sung. They could be carried by oral tradition, including the music, much of the way we memorize hymn verses and they just stick with us. So they could have accumulated over a long period of time. There's 150 of them, and only later on got set down in writing. And then probably that collection is fixed by the year 200 BC. But just looking at the content of the Psalms, you can tell that they had really spread all the way until from the time of David, at least, to time beyond the return from exile. I want to look at some of the captions we have on the Psalms. You often find these captions at the beginning of Psalms. Why are they there? They're not modern captions. They are part of the original sacred text, and that's why they are included. But so Psalm 3 is a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son, attributed to David. And the occasion is noted there. Psalm 4, it's to the choir master with stringed instruments. So this was to be sung, accompanied. A psalm of David. Now when you see that, a psalm of David, it could be David himself, but it could also be a psalm that comes out of David's court, which goes far beyond the time of David. Then Psalm 8. To the choir master according to the Gittith. That's probably a musical or liturgical term, and we just don't know what it means. And again, from David or the court of David. Some other captions. Again, to the choir master. So these are supposed to be sung in worship. A maskil. Don't know what that is. Of the sons of Korah. Yes, they are also psalm writers. That's the 42nd psalm. A psalm of Asaph. We have a lot of psalms of Asaph. That's Psalm 50. And then 58. To the choir master according to do not destroy. A miktam of David. Do not destroy is most likely the tune that they were supposed to use. And we don't really know what a miktam is. It's some form of poetry. Now, at this point in time, folks often wonder, can we figure out how those psalms sounded when they were sung? Well, it's not easy. The Judeans and then the Jews beyond them did not continue to keep an oral tradition of their music. And of course, there was no musical notation. And so as the psalms got used within Judaism, spreading around the world, they used the kind of musical styles that were natural wherever they would go. If you go to a Jewish synagogue today, you'll find plenty of music, but most of it sounds like Schubert. And of course, within the Christian community, where this was their original hymnal as well, the singing of those psalms evolved over the years. However, the Samaritans, those were the people of the northern tribe of Israel that were left when the rest were carried away, and some outsiders settled with them. They continued a form of Old Testament religion. There is a Samaritan Pentateuch, or Samaritan Torah, and there's also Samaritan Psalms. And the Samaritans still exist today in Palestine as a very small community, but they have kept alive that oral tradition of the music itself. And so the closest thing we can really get to what the sung psalms in the Old Testament would have sounded like is by listening to Samaritan psalmody. And I'll give you a sample, and you're not going to like it. That's enough. A little bit goes a long ways, and it's just utterly, utterly foreign to us. Well, we're going to move on now to another piece of poetry there in the writings, and that's the Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon. And you'll notice there on the writings chart, there's a Star of David by it. There are 5 scrolls that have a Star of David by them. I did that to indicate these are what would have been called the 5 rolls. Yeah, 5 rolls. They were all appointed for various festivals. And so even the poorest synagogue that maybe couldn't afford a complete Torah even would certainly have had these 5 rolls for the festivals. So Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, is appointed for being sung at Passover time. And it begins with verse 1, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. It identifies it. But then verse 2 is immediately, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Wow. Well, this is erotic love poetry. This erotic love poetry. What's it doing in the Bible? Well, first of all, on one hand, it celebrates human love, romantic love, as good, as good. We go on to chapter 2, verse 10 through 11. My love speaks to me and says, "Arise, my love, my beautiful one, and come away, for behold, winter is past, the rain is over and gone." That's a celebration of human love. But from earliest times, Jewish rabbis and then Christians beyond would find in this also a mirror or a reflection of the love of God for Israel. I have a little short story to tell about my experience. In Omaha, as a campus pastor, I had developed a very fine music group called the New Song. And two of my members were Jeff and Christy, who, like all the students in this commuter campus setting, were from local families, went to local churches. And so when it came time for them to get married, it would be in their local church where Jeff had grown up and was confirmed by the pastor who confirmed them. And as so often would happen, they would come to me and say, "Would you write a piece of music for our wedding?" So I said I would. And I wrote a fairly simple piece for just a couple of instruments, a guitar and a flute, and then a baritone voice. And it was based upon this passage and beyond. Our chorus went, "Arise, my love, come away, my fair one, the winter is past." Well, 4 months later, I was sitting in church there, not in the balcony this time, but down in the pews with my wife, Helen. And the occasion was the funeral of Jeff's father, who had suddenly passed away with a heart attack. But of course, sitting there, what would fill my mind was the music that I had written for that wedding, and suddenly I understood more deeply and leaned over to Helen and I said, "We could be singing 'Arise, my love' on this day. Come away, my fair one, the rain is over and gone." We go on to another set of poetry, Lamentations, 5 chapters. It's appointed to be used on the 9th of Ab. That's the 5th month in the Jewish year, the 9th of Ab. And it commemorates the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Babylonians, and later on the destruction of the temple by the Romans. So Lamentations begins like this: "How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she who was great among the nations." Yes, it's a lament all the way through. Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. She now dwells among the nations, but finds no resting place. They are scattered. They are scattered. It's 5 laments over the wasteland of Jerusalem and Judea. Usually we think it may be called the Lamentations of Jeremiah, but it's probably the Lamentations of his writer, Baruch, who also has a poetic book in his name, Baruch, which it's in the Apocrypha. We are not going to get into it at all, really. Mixed exile materials from the exile in Babylon, written from in Babylon, 5 or 6 chapters. The 6th chapter is singled out and called the letter of Jeremiah, which is whether it is actually from Jeremiah or from Baruch. That's a letter to the Judeans, warning them against the gods of Babylon. Now we're going to move on to the next set of writings, which were called wisdom literature. The wisdom literature of Israel is also in poetic form, the form we discussed last time. It's in a form of proverbs or wise sayings. They're all practical and very down to earth. And the one we know most of all is Proverbs. No real reference in Proverbs to Israel's history or future. It's just philosophical wisdom literature from a long period, probably from the time of Solomon on through into the Persian period. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity. And so it's lessons to be learned. Later on, though, we find a heading. These are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. So they would have come down by oral tradition, at least to the time of Hezekiah. And then another proverb later on is called the words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him. So they're spread over a long period of time. There's an interesting personification of wisdom. Wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the market she raises her voice. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? And often in wisdom literature, wisdom is portrayed as an emanation of God, but as female. In Proverbs 8 we read, the Lord begat me at the beginning of his works, the first of his acts of old. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, there I was beside him like a master workman. And interestingly, the same kind of image is used to talk about Jesus in the beginning of the gospel according to John. The Word was in the beginning, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and then the Word became flesh. Interesting tie-in there from the New Testament. We go on. Job comes into writing in this Temple Second period, but it really probably goes, well, the story is set back in the time of patriarchs. And the story, which begins and ends the book of Job, about Job and his disasters and in his recovery, probably was ancient, an ancient oral tradition. And then in the wisdom period, we end up having the other verses in between, which is wisdom literature. Probably the verse which we know best of all, because it is used in Handel's Messiah. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet without my flesh I shall see God. And we go on. Other wisdom literature, unfamiliar to us really. Well, first of all, no, Ecclesiastes is. Ecclesiastes means the preacher, and it is the teacher. It is appointed for the Feast of the Tabernacles. It may draw on older material, but represents the wisdom period. The most familiar part is from chapter 3. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up what is planted, and on and on and on. Words that became very familiar to many of us, set to music in our folk music period. Now some lesser known, they are in the Apocrypha. Wisdom of Solomon, Syriac. Wisdom of Solomon, definitely not Solomon, but definitely from the period of wisdom literature. A further personification of wisdom as the hand of God. And then Sirach is actually the wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach. A big book, 55 chapters. It reads like Proverbs, but its introduction actually places it very late and from Egypt, from the Jewish community in Egypt. Now we get into the stories. all kinds of stories there in this period of writings. One is the story of Ruth, which we're quite familiar with. It also has a Star of David by it, one of the 5 roles, appointed to be sung at Pentecost, which the Jewish harvest festival of Pentecost was the early barley harvest. And the barley harvest features very much there in the book of Ruth. The story basically is that Ruth and her husband and 2 sons move east up into Moab, which is a mountainous country, because of a famine. And often moisture coming across Palestine might not have dropped a drop on Judea, but it got lifted up there into Moab, and Moab became a garden spot. And so they go there, and the sons grow up and marry wives, Naomi and Orpah. And then Ruth's husband and the 2 sons both die, leaving the 3 widows. And finally, when Ruth hears the famine is over down in Judea, it's time for her to go back to her hometown of Bethlehem, and Naomi goes with her. This was set, interestingly, in the time of the judges. In the days when the judges ruled, there was famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. So it's really talking about a former time period. Interesting notes like this. Now, it was the custom in former times in Israel. So this comes into writing late in the writings period, but it refers back to those former times. Interestingly, it's going to end up with there in Bethlehem, Ruth is discovered by a kinsman, Boaz. They get married, and then the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So you see, Ruth becomes the great-grandmother of King David. Her name also gets mentioned in the New Testament, in the first chapter of Matthew, which is a genealogy, and there are only 5 women named there. One is Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the other 4 are all foreigners. Ruth is one of them. All foreigners. As Matthew is trying to, I think, express here that Jesus, a true son of Israel, a descendant of David, also though has the blood of many nations in his veins. Some other writings. Tobit, a tale taken from the Babylonian captivity about the northern kingdom. The book of Judith, a tale from the Assyrian assault on Jerusalem, where she seduces the enemy general, and then when he falls asleep, she cuts his head off. Then back to the writings, again, Esther. Esther, we're familiar with Esther. Again, it has a star. It's one of the roles, the 5 roles, to be read at Purim, which is talked about in the book of Esther. It takes place in the Persian period with later additions. There's no mention of God in the whole book, not even in disguise. But there it is. And it is a celebration of the freedom that Israel would often come into after times of conflict. Well, now we're going to move from Esther to Daniel, the apocalyptic literature, only one of those in the Old Testament. It's 12 chapters long. The first half is a narrative, really narrative stories about Daniel and his companions. It begins with, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So we know that history. But then the king commanded Aspenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both the royal family and the nobility, youths without blemish, and teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. He's going to educate these young men. And so those 6 chapters are stories about Daniel and his companions, stories like Daniel in the lion's den, and stories of the 3 men in the fiery furnace. And then we go on into the last 6 chapters, which are apocalyptic, like the book of Revelation in the New Testament. They are visionary things, visionary visions, dreams. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. And that's where the Son of Man image and title originates, that then is used very often in the New Testament. Well, there are some other additions to Daniel, some stories, Susanna, Bel, and the dragon. These have dropped out of Daniel in the Old Testament portion into the apocryphal books. Which brings us now to the end of the writings period, and actually to the end of the Old Testament. Next week, we're going to step just beyond all of this time into the beginning of the 1st century, the time of Jesus and his followers. And we're going to be asking the question, what was the shape of Holy Scripture at the time of Jesus and his immediate followers? So, look forward to being with you then in the final session, session 10, and we'll talk then about what will go beyond that and when.